That summer, the river smelled of rain on warm stone, and we learned to listen. I was the youngest of 3 curious children and a handful of cousins, who seemed to multiply each July like wildflowers along the water's edge. Our aunt's cottage sat on a bend, where willows leaned over the bank, and the air carried the hum of 100 late summer gnats and distant laughter from the town, a sound so ordinary it felt sacred. It was the kind of holiday that doesn't begin with fireworks or promises, but with a kettle on the stove and a heap of sun-bleached towels drying on the lawn, and you already know you'll carry it inside you for years. We spent one whole week pretending the river belonged to us, and maybe it did. The first morning, Father found a driftwood plank and a handful of stubborn nails in the shed that stood behind the well house, and he decided we would fashion a raft. It wasn't a grand raft, just a rough-edged thing of weathered boards and rope, the kind that squeaked and breathed as you worked it, like a patient animal learning to trust you. We set to work under the sun that burned the tops of our ears and left our shoulders slick with resin and sweat. The air tasted of pine sap and dust, of apricot preserves cooling on the sill, and the faint, hopeful smell of rain somewhere beyond the hills. I remember the moment the raft first seemed to take on a life of its own. My sister's small hands, stubborn and exact, tied a knot that wouldn't loosen even when the boards shifted in the heat. My cousin chipped at the stubborn edge of a nail with a chipped file, as if he were polishing a gem he'd found in the river's mouth. And there, between the creaking boards and our uncertain breathing, the raft finally breathed back at us, slow, a little proud, as if to say, "See?" We pushed off from the muddy shore in the late afternoon, when the sun hung low and pale over the water, turning it to a thin sheet of gold that seemed to glow from within. The current was gentle as a cat's whisker, tugging at the raft's edges without fear or anger, and I learned to listen to the river's quiet instructions, the way it urged us to keep the boat steady, to shield our faces from the glare, to slow down when a snag stood in our path, and the rope protested against the knot we hadn't yet learned to tie. We drifted past a stand of cattails, their tops swaying like green flames, past a fence where a weathered scarecrow stood sentry and watched us with a sun-dried grin. The water wore a sound we could almost touch, a soft whoosh and a distant splash, the way rain sounds when it first hits a roof and then becomes part of the street outside your window. On the raft, we learned to measure time by the river's pace rather than by the clock on the mantel. It moved in a way that felt both intimate and endless, a private corridor with walls made of sky. The world narrowed to the narrow beam of sunlight that slid across the planks, to the rough texture of the rope in my fingers, to the chorus of our whispered jokes and the occasional sparkling laughter that drew out from the bank whenever we caught sight of a fish darting beneath the raft's shadow. My older brother, who had a way of pretending the world was a ship filled with treasure maps, declared that we would sail beyond the bend and discover the true country of the heart. My sister rolled her eyes in mock exasperation, though her smile betrayed her own tender belief in the magic of the moment. And even my cousin, forever in a hurry to grow up, slowed down, listening to the river as if it might tell him which way to go. We did not find a treasure that day, not in any chest or map, but we found something subtler, a language the water spoke, how to listen for the telltale dip of the oar when we drifted too close to the reeds, how to breathe in unison so the raft would not creak with fear. There were moments when the world opened up like the lid of a well and showed us a clean, bright reflection of ourselves, the exactness of our hands, the tremor in the corner of a smile. Away a shared breath lowered our shoulders, and in that shared work and pace, something old and solid settled into me, that care is a practice, and patience is a kind of power. Even the small failures carried their own kind of grace. When a nail gave way or a knot slipped free, we did not scatter in frustration. We paused, we fixed, we learned the feel of the rope's resistance. The way cedar-smelling wood would forgive us if we offered a gentler touch. The river did not demand instant mastery. It offered a measured pace, enough time for mistakes to be noticed, enough space to correct them, enough silence for a thought to settle into a memory. I realize now that those little moments, holds, knots, careful adjustments, were the scaffolding of the rest of my life. A habit of doing small tasks carefully, of not rushing to judgment about a person or a situation, of trusting that time and kindness can toil together and yield something sturdy. That night, after a supper of grilled fish and potatoes the colour of late dusk, we came back to the cottage with salt still on our skin and the river's scent clinging to our clothes. The kitchen smelled of fresh bread and cinnamon, of rain-warmed towels drying on chairs, of a pot of tea that steamed like a small, patient cloud. The house settled around us. The old boards sighed, the kettle sang, the floorboards gave a gentle creak under our weight, as if the room remembered us from 100 summers ago. In front of the hearth, our grandmother, small and bright-eyed, with a face that wore both worry and warmth like a familiar coat, told us stories of boats and storms and mothers who'd saved their children by sheer stubborn love. The stories didn't rescue us from fear, they clarified it, turning danger into something knowable and manageable, something that could be faced with a slow breath and a steady hand. And there, in the circle of lamplight and language, I understood something I would carry long after the river's memory faded from the shore. How a life is stitched together not by grand moments, but by the patient, unremarkable hours in which we choose to show up for one another. The raft taught us the value of work that yields a shared outcome. The kitchen taught us the tenderness that makes even ordinary meals sacred. The river taught us that to belong to a place is to learn its language, to listen, to wait, to adjust, to give more than you take, to accept that not every plan survives the journey, yet the journey itself remains a blessing. In the years since that summer, I have watched the water slow and darken as the world grew larger and heavier with time. I have watched children grow and then grow old, as the river kept its old habit of changing, just enough to remind us that nothing stays the same, not forever. And yet there are gifts that time cannot erase, small and stubborn as the last stubborn knot you tie in the fading light. The sensitive, steady work of a life. How I learned to mend a chair. How I learned to cradle a crying child. How I learned to say a hard word without anger and a soft word without fear. These are the gifts the river left with me, tucked into the corners of my days, like pebbles in the pocket of a long, quiet walk. What I carry most now is the memory of the raft's slow drift, the way the water lifted us with a patient grace, rather than with a shout. It is not glory I recall, but a certain fidelity to small things, a trust that goodness can be built from the simplest actions, tying a knot, guiding a wooden plank through the spray, letting the river teach you to wait for the next moment, not the next victory. If I speak softly of that summer, it is because I want to remember what I now, on mornings when the light comes through the blinds in thin gold ribbons, and the house holds its breath between sleep and waking, I listen for the old river in a different way. The sound isn't loud, but it is certain. The same whisper of reeds, and the same distant gulls that used to ride the breeze along the bend. The memory is not loud either. It sits quietly at my elbow, a patient elder with a kind smile, reminding me to slow down, to notice the way the world smells after a rain, and the way a child's question can rise like a bubble from the water and pop with a truth I can only recognize in retrospect. I am grateful for having learned, at such a young age, that belonging is a craft, that love is a practice of steady hands and listening ears, that the ordinary day is enough to carry a lifetime if you attend to it with care. Time passes, yes. But the river's lesson travels with me. A quiet map pressed into the palm that steadies me when the road ahead grows rougher than the last stretch we walked. And I suppose that is the gift of memory, not to keep a thing pristine as if it were new,